Rasa Festival, music from the East and the West.
My name is Dr. Peyton McDonald. I live out in New Jersey. I'm a professor of music at William Patterson University, which is one of the state colleges in New Jersey. It's about 20 miles west of New York City. And I have a very rich and wonderful dual career as a Western percussionist, playing marimba and drum set and all the different percussion instruments, and as an East Indian Hindustani vocalist, which is more of what I'll be sharing with you tonight. And I've been studying North Indian classical music for 22 years, first as a tabla drummer under the guidance of the great Pandit Sharda Sahayji from the Banaras Baj, and then I switched over to the dark side of vocals many years back, and I've been learning from the great Gundecha brothers, who are some of the world's top performers of Drupad, which is a particular style of music that I'll explain a little bit more as we go on. Want to introduce yourself?
My name is Hemant Baptiwale. I live here in Michigan in Farmington Hills, and I started studying tabla when I was 8 years old, and still learning. Now I am taking training with Ustad Zakir Hussain, and also I learn from several other artists who visit Michigan when they are on the tour. So I learned in the style of the Delhi and Farrukhabad gharanas, there are 6 schools in tabla, and Farrukhabad is very popular one that I studied mostly, and I'm also familiar with some other gharanas as well. Today I'm accompanying Peyton ji, and I'm trying to play the tabla, but in the Pakhwaj style. So we are going to, he's going to sing Drupad composition, and usually that is accompanied not on tabla but on Pakhwaj, which is a single barrel drum that you play on sideways. But a lot of the tabla literature has actually come from Pakhwaj, and there are a lot of similarities. So hope you will enjoy.
So the basic theme of tonight is East meets West. And so the plan is, first we're going to make some music for you for about 15 minutes or so. And then I'm going to present a lecture where I introduce you to a whole bunch of other artists who are also exploring East-West music. And some of their work is much closer to jazz, some of it's much closer to Western classical music, some of it's right in the middle. But I'll share with you some really lovely music. In terms of what we're doing tonight, I'm going to sing for you a raga called Rag Kirvani. If any of you have had Western music training, the mode is similar to what we would call a harmonic minor scale. But ragas are much more than scales. They're a whole constellation of things that include ornaments and swarastan, which is the tuning, certain melodic patterns, pakad, et cetera, et cetera. So it's more than just a scale. It's like when you get to know a person. A person is more than just a name or a height or an eye color, but a person has many, many things about them that make them special. And that's true for ragas too. So I'm going to sing Rag Kirvani for you, and I'm going to do it in somewhat of a traditional manner. So I'll present the alap. It'll be in 4 movements. You could think of it that way. Alap, Jor, Jala, and the Bundish. The alap, Jor, Jala, I'm not going to be singing text. I'm going to be singing a series of syllables that we use in the style I've been trained in. A, ranana, rire, ranana, teta, ranana. These are all derived from an ancient Vedic mantra. But in fact, I'm not really speaking the mantra. They've just become stylized as a musical device. And then finally, in the 4th movement, Hemantji will join me in the 3rd movement. And then in the 4th movement, I will finally sing text. And this is a composition I composed myself, and the text is in Latin. So that's a little bit of the Western flavor. So when we get there, I'll share with you the text, and we'll keep going. So this is Rag Kirvani. That would bring us to the end of the first movement, the alap, where we just open up the raga. And now we go into the jor, where we bring a slow groove. The second movement, and you may have noticed by now that this isn't a flashy kind of music. So this is about a 700-year-old tradition of music making, and in the very early days the artists would sing this music in Hindu temples, but they weren't looking at the people coming in and out of the temples. They were turned the other way. They were looking at the murtis, at the statues, at the pujas. So right from the beginning, this music never had really a commercial intent at all. It was always designed to be a devotional music as a way, and it is often considered nada yoga, a form of yoga, a yoga that is practiced through sound. The term yoga roughly translates as to yoke or to connect with something. So even though we will get into some faster tempos and more exciting stuff now, this is a long ways from Bollywood or American popular music. So this next stage is called Jhala, and my friend Hemantji will join me for this part. Finishes the third movement, and then we'll conclude with the composition. So, the text for this composition was composed by Tinctorus, who was a musical theorist in the 13th century in what is 14th century in what is now known as was known as the Low Countries. And the text is Musicae Deum, music is God, Divinam Laudem, brings divine praise, Mentem elevat, it elevates the mind, Ecstasim causat, it causes ecstasy, is the first half. Duritiam cordis resolvit, it softens hard hearts. Scientes eus beatificat, let's see, how does that translate exactly? So basically it's causing a kind of ecstasy and a beauty in the life because of the quality of music. So you're gonna see me clapping and waving my hands a little bit. This music is set in a rhythmic cycle of 10 beats, but it's kind of a fast 10 beats, so we feel it in 5, like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And my partner up here is going to be playing a pattern on his drums that cycles around and round. We call it a teka, and it gives a color and a shape to this rhythmic cycle. So that concludes the performance part of the presentation. And especially I want to thank Hemantji for getting up here and playing so beautifully and so sensitively and with about 35 seconds of rehearsal. But that's one of the beautiful things about Indian classical music, is that it's a common vocabulary. We used to have this in the West. We called it the common practice. Back in the days, really starting in the high Baroque era up through into the what we call the Romantic period in the textbooks into the 19th century, there was a common vocabulary shared by all the musicians. So it was possible that Mozart could get together with someone from a neighboring town, and they could play together and improvise together because they had the same grammar and the same syntax. We've lost that in the West. That's gone away. Now composers are, it's a Tower of Babel. Everyone's writing their own music with their own influences and their own styles. It's very exciting. It's very invigorating. It's very personal. It's also very bewildering to audiences. So you never get something for nothing in life. But in Indian classical music, the idea of a common language has been preserved. So even though this is our first time performing together, we've been studying the same language for many, many decades. So it's kind of like two French speakers who have never known each other come together. They can still speak French together. It's a little bit like that. Okay, so I'll move over to the lectern and we'll bring down the thing and we'll talk some more about East-West music. Okay, so as I said, I teach out at William Patterson University, and at the university I direct the percussion program. So I'd say 80% of my time at the university I'm conducting the percussion ensemble and teaching snare drum lessons, but I also teach a course on Indian classical music, and I usually have about 25 or so people, and that's like a lecture format. And then I teach lessons vocally, sometimes individually and sometimes in small groups. And I'll tell you more about how I got into all this later on. So I'm going to run you through very quickly some early beginnings in the way that Western music and Indian music started to connect. And I won't get in too much detail. I don't want this to become too academic because I want to show you. So I have some nice videos and musical examples so you can actually hear it. But just to give you a little bit of context. So in the late 18th century, as you know, British had a stronghold in India. And many of the British people who were there started learning Indian music or started learning more about the culture. One of these is William Jones, who in 1784 founded the Asiatic Society of Bengal. We had one of our first translations of the Gita into English. William Jones also discovered an interesting link between Sanskrit and European languages. And that's about all I can tell you about that. I'm not a linguist. But and then local languages became mandatory for British administrators as decreed by the East Indian Company. And that's kind of interesting because what that meant is that as the administrators began learning the language, even though they were there as colonists in a rather ruthless occupation of the country, some of them did indeed become more sensitive to the nuances of the culture, of beautiful Indian culture. And that started a little bit of growing awareness, at least on the Western side, to how much there was there. And then also in 1792, we got this very first book about Indian music called On the Modes of the Hindus by William Jones. It's not a very good book. Most of it is completely wrong. But it was a first attempt to try to understand something about this music. And one of the interesting things, I think one of the reasons a lot of it is wrong is that it's a book. So the thing about Indian classical music, whether you're learning the northern style or the southern style, is that it's an oral tradition. You have to sit with a guru. There is no other way to learn it. You can't learn it from a book, definitely not from a book. You can't learn it from a YouTube video, a podcast, nothing like that. You have to sit one-on-one with a guru. And that hasn't changed, and it is my professional opinion, I don't see that changing, unless AI gets to a point where it can handle that. But the thing is, with gurus, you learn a lot more than music, right? So I don't think AI can ever replace that. Okay, so there were various receptions to Indian music by the colonists in the early days, and I have this little reference to this book by Farrell. There's very little scholarly text about East-West music, but one of the very best ones is by this gentleman named Jerry Farrell. It's called Indian Music in the West, and I'm going to read a few short things out of that for you tonight. This is one of them that I wanted to read to you. So some of the people who heard this music really didn't understand it. And really couldn't understand it because they were coming only from a Western perspective. So here's an example of someone who didn't understand it. The singers possess such admirable lungs that they are able to continue without diminution through the long night. Their screeching notes break in upon all conversation, and come upon the sense with so little harmony that it is difficult to avoid rushing into the street with both hands to your ears. All right, so that's an example of someone who's hearing Indian classical music, not understanding what's going on and not enjoying it. But there were other people, as far back as the 18th century, who were hearing it and were beginning to understand what makes it so special and beautiful. This is a quote from a woman named Marianne Postins, and she writes, "A Hindu musician uses his gamut like the figures of a Chinese puzzle or the beads of a kaleidoscope, shifting them into the most singular positions, yet every change bearing a most fraternal resemblance to the rest. A transition is seldom made from the original key, and although they possess a great variety of modes, their skill seems to be displayed in the exercise of peculiar ingenuity." And again, she's only getting a real sort of glimpse at what makes Indian music so special, but she did lock onto something that's very true, that in one of the things that Indian musicians do to a very high level of sophistication is they take basic elements and move them and rearrange them in ways creating continual variation and interest. So for example, in tabla drumming, we have this process called kaida and palta. Kaida is like a theme, the palta is the variations. And a very top level tabla drummer like Hemantji's Guruji Zakir Hussain can take one theme and spin out variations for 10 or 15 or even 20 minutes, and not one of the variations will repeat. And it's beautiful the way he can keep moving and rearranging the notes. Now, if you're listening in an inattentive way, it'll just sound like a stream of notes and you won't know what's going on. But with a little bit of education and the right mindset, you begin to hear this incredible level of variety, and it's absolutely captivating. And the level of mastery to do that is quite stunning. So there were three, as we get into the 20th century, there were three major figures who brought Indian music to the West, and that's when our interactions start to become a little bit more mature, although it's really not to the 1960s that it takes off. But one of those is Hazrat Inayat Khan, the other is Tagore, and the other one is Uday Shankar. All right, so I'll look at each of these quickly. I don't need to read this, I'll let you read that. Khan was a Sufi, and his Sufi beliefs were very important to his music making. So this is kind of an interesting story, is when he first comes to New York City, and he eventually meets this woman named Ruth St. Denis. And I'll let you read that quickly. I can guess what you're thinking is, how in the world does a Turkish cigarette advertisement figure into Indian classical music? And the answer is, it doesn't. This is probably one of the worst, most egregious cases of cultural appropriation you could ever have. However, it's one of the first attempts we have for some interaction. So there is a picture of her, and I actually dug up this YouTube video of one of her early quote-unquote Oriental dances. So I'll show that to you so you can see what she was doing here. There's no sound to this video, so you just, I'll just let it run for maybe 30 seconds here, but you can kind of see what she was up to. Yeah, for some reason they don't provide any music to this, but you can imagine, so Hazrat Inayat Khan had an ensemble of musicians that he was providing accompaniment for this. And this was one of her attempts at sort of imitating what she thought was Indian music. And those of you who know a lot about Indian dance are thinking, my goodness, this has nothing to do with Kathak or anything else. But remember where we are. We're not quite there yet historically, okay? We're moving in a direction of a more sensitive understanding of the cultures here. Okay. So what was interesting is she started making these dances and touring with them for almost 20 years. And she built her whole career on this idea of these Indian dances and this Orientalism. But she never actually went to India until about 20 years later. And then when she did, she had this experience that I'll read to you. So she goes to India, and the first thing she does is she goes to the bathing ghats in Benares or Varanasi. The ghats, for those of you who haven't been there, are like these big staircases that lead down into the Ganges River. And she says, when we arrived back at the hotel, I sat for an hour without moving, for it seemed to me, in spite of all I could summon up of spiritual realization and the knowledge that this was the very highest analysis, but a horrid dream, that God had forsaken this world and nothing remained but horrible broken bodies and piteous eyes. If 20 years before I had seen any such sight, there would have been no Rudha, that was one of her famous dances, and perhaps no career. So she had built up in her mind this ideal image of what India was. And she thought that there were all these happy people floating around doing these beautiful dances, like I guess what she saw in this Turkish cigarette advertisement. It's very bizarre. And then she goes to India and she experiences a level of poverty I don't think she had seen. Now, we all know India is a very large and complex country, and yes, they have poverty, but they also have extraordinary wealth and everything in between. There's a large middle class, just like you have in the United States. I had a similar experience in the sense that I started listening to Indian classical music every day when I was 11 years old. Now, I was born and raised in Idaho. There's not much of an Indian community where I grew up, and certainly no concerts, nothing like the kind of stuff you have in Ann Arbor or a place like University of Michigan. My portal to the world of the arts was the public library. It's actually kind of nice that I'm here tonight. Thankfully, we had a really good public library, and when I was about 11 years old, I went in one day and I found this big stack of records, Ali Akbar Khan, Ravi Shankar, Vilayat Khan, and I thought, wow, this looks really interesting. And that's also, true story, the same day that I discovered Vladimir Horowitz, Glenn Gould playing Bach, Bruno Walter conducting Beethoven. And so I walked out of the library with a stack of, this was in the LP days, I'm older than I look, a stack of LPs of Western classical music under one arm and Indian classical music under the other arm. And that has essentially set the tone for my whole career for the last 30 years or so. So I started listening to Indian classical music every day until I was 19 when I first came here. I did my undergraduate at the University of Michigan in the School of Music. And at that point, I was finally able to start going to Indian concerts, interacting with an Indian community, and I was able to start getting some instruction. And my first instrument that I started learning was tabla. But it wasn't until a couple years later, 2002, that I finally actually got to go to India. And I mean, I had read enough and seen enough films, and I had a lot of Indian friends and so on. I knew India was a complex society and very large, and but I still, in my mind, had this idea that maybe a lot of people would be sitting under banyan trees and meditating, and there would be sitar music floating around. And I arrived in Delhi on New Year's Eve. And what I discovered is that Delhi on New Year's Eve is quite possibly one of the loudest and most chaotic and craziest places in the world. And I was very quickly disabused of my sort of idealistic idea of what India was. And I began to gain a more mature and reasonable understanding of the culture from then on out. And now I've been to India, I guess, 7 or 8 times. My shortest visit was a month. My longest was 9 months. I was on a Fulbright back in 2013-14. So, and in the Fulbright, my wife and 2 daughters, we all went. I had a scooty, and it was an amazing experience. So. Okay, Tagore, I think most of you may know his work, one of the great geniuses of the 20th century in so many different areas. And he also produced this huge body of music, over 2,000 songs. And these songs, he studied some Western classical music, and he learned how to read and write Western music, and he notated a lot of these songs himself. And a lot of them, he's using Western ideas of harmony and melody mixed with Indian ideas of modality and raga. So I'm not going to play any, I'm going to move on a little bit. Uday Shankar was Ravi Shankar's older brother, and he came over to the United States and Europe before Ravi Shankar did. And he was one of the first people to start collaborating with East-West dance choreography. It's interesting now, 2 dancers we've had, a lot of times musical movements do come through dance interactions and collaborations. So this was the case here. And then, of course, Ravi Shankar comes over, first in the 1930s with his brother, but then really as a sitar player on his own in the late 1950s and 60s. And we know all about the explosion there, especially when he became friends with George Harrison from the Beatles. And actually it might be fun to watch this quickly. There's a short little clip here on YouTube of him giving George Harrison a lesson.
cheating. Da 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 da. Let's go. Da 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 da.
So they tried, and by all accounts, George Harrison was quite a serious student. I mean, he really did want to learn, and he was really genuinely moved by the music, and quite a talented student, according to Ravi Shankar. But in Ravi Shankar's autobiography, he has a great chapter, I think it's called A Beatle in Bombay, where he explains how they tried to do these lessons in this hotel room, and it just didn't work because the Beatle mania had even spread to India. And there were just, and also Ravi Shankar's star had risen greatly. I mean, he was becoming one of the world's most famous musicians. And so there were these huge crowds of people down on the street, and they were making so much noise, they couldn't actually get through the lessons. So it didn't really work. But as best he could, George Harrison kept going with it. And what's interesting is if you listen to the different Beatles tunes, the early tunes, his playing is very rudimentary and not so great, actually. But as the years go on, before the Beatles split up, he gets better, and his playing gets more sophisticated and more nuanced, and his understanding of Indian music gets deeper, and the way in which the Beatles are weaving some ideas of tala and raga into their songs becomes more interesting. We don't have time to go through all that today, but something to check out. There have been some more recent collaborations now. This is a very nice video I want to show you with Anushka Shankar, who's Ravi Shankar's daughter. And one of the world's preeminent sitar players now, and Joshua Bell, who is one of the world's top violin players. What I hear when I listen to this whole video is I essentially hear about 90% Indian music and about 10% Western. Right? I mean, we do have a Western element because we have the violin. He's reading music. There's some formal elements because it's written out and structured in such a way that's Western. But really, this isn't what I would consider a true 50-50 really meeting of the cultures. This is more like we have something happening in one culture and we kind of add this little thing from the other. Personally, I think it's successful. I think it's very beautiful and very interesting. And really, this is a second generation because her father did a collaboration with Yehudi Menuhin, who is a great violinist of the time. And those collaborations are interesting. I think they're less good than these. I think this one's better, partly because the recording quality is so much better. But, okay, so moving on. So we get other areas that I think work a little bit better, and one of these, which I think is the fusion is happening at a little deeper level, is by Rudresh Mahanthappa. Rudresh is, I think, close to about 50 years old now. He's now running the jazz program at Princeton University in New Jersey. He's a wonderful guy. I've met him a few times and heard him play. And what's interesting about Rudresh is he was born here in America, grew up an American boy, essentially, and as a saxophone player, that's his instrument, he was learning first blues and American jazz and rock and roll. That's his background. And it was only later in his life, when he got into his 20s and 30s, that he started learning Indian classical music. And now he has these various projects where he mixes them. So I'll show you one of those.
Western elements and Indian elements can mingle very easily and very freely and result in something that's hopefully hasn't been heard before. I went to India a few times over the course of my Guggenheim Fellowship to study some very specific concepts of rhythm and melody from Indian music. But I wanted to bring those concepts into a situation that wasn't quintessentially Indian.
So I'm personally a fan of this. I think what makes Rudresh's music particularly successful in terms of the ways he's bringing Eastern and Western music together is that he's doing it at a grammatical level. So it's not the case that he's just taking a sitar and what I call the sitar and the rock band syndrome, which is a little bit, I guess, a pejorative jab at the Beatles, but he's not just sort of throwing in an Indian instrument in a Western context to give it this sort of Indian color, or vice versa, throwing in a Western instrument into an Indian context to give it a little bit of a Western vibe. But he's actually grappling with ideas of how rhythms work on a very deep level, structural ideas, how melodies and specific scales can work together between the traditions. And personally, I think that's very interesting, and I think he does it very well. Another one of the most important people who came over to the West and brought this music, and it ended up spreading and fusing with Western music, is Pandit Pran Nath. He first came over in the late 1960s, primarily because of the work of Monte Young and Terry Riley, who were students of his, and they brought him over. And he just basically focused on his style of singing, which was Indian classical music, but his students ended up melding it together with various things. So there's Lamont and Marion. Lamont is a genius. He's also kind of crazy, but he has this project called the Well-Tuned Piano, and it's hard to find clips of this because he keeps taking them down, but so if you've listened to a lot of piano music, you may have noticed already that the piano sounds a little different than what you're used to hearing. Lamont became fascinated with the early part of a raga exposition called the alap. So if you remember when I sang earlier, the first movement, I called it a movement, was very slow. It was very kind of austere. It was a lot of long-held tones. And that's a very good place to really explore the way the notes I'm singing relate to the drone instrument. Now, tonight we were using an app, but the real instrument is called a tampura, and it looks sort of like a very large lute or a sitar of sorts. And it has 4 or 5 strings, and you just pluck them over and over. You don't play melodies on this instrument. You just pluck the strings, and it creates this beautiful harmonic field. So the notes that I was singing tonight were not like the notes on a regular Western piano. They were tuned differently. Some of them I tuned very carefully and very specifically with a lot of help from my gurus on how to do this. I would tune the notes slightly higher or slightly lower, and some of the notes move around a fair amount. So Lamont became very fascinated with that idea, but he then went back to the piano, which is the least flexible of the instruments, and what he did is he completely retuned it. So the tuning he's using is a just intonation scheme that is quite different than the equal temperament that we normally use on Western pianos. And what that provides, that means that the harmonies he's playing resonate very differently in your body. That's the final upshot of it. It feels different in your body. There's all kinds of math involved, but that's all irrelevant. What really matters is the way it feels in your body. So listen for another minute and just kind of listen to the way these tones resonate. So this piece is long in its entirety. It's over 6 hours. I have actually, there is a recording of it, and I have sat through the whole thing. It does get busier after a while, but not as much as you might think. I mean, he'll often spend 40 minutes or so doing what he's doing right there. But if you're in the right mindset and you have a good set of speakers, or even better, if you're with him in the right kind of room, it's an extraordinary experience. It really is. You will get these feelings in your body you've never had, and you'll hear these tones colliding and bouncing off each other in these just phenomenally beautiful ways. It's really a special work of art. So Terry Riley was Lamont's, or is Lamont's friend. They're both still alive. They're in their 80s now, and also studied with Pandit Pran Nath. His approach was a little bit different. He got very interested in working with electronic keyboards, and especially looping ones. So he takes these ideas of alap and raga, and he moves them over to these keyboards with all these looping devices. Okay, turn up a little bit. Okay, so much stuff. I have to kind of blow through all this. So one of the ideas I've been working on is this idea of polyphony. Polyphony meaning many voices. Polyphony is one of the things that really is one of the Western music's great gifts to the world. And no other culture, I think, has developed polyphony to the level that we have in the West. And part of that is in our notation system, and our large ensembles are connected to that. The large ensembles, the notation system, polyphony are all connected together, all grew out in the medieval era in the great cathedrals in Europe. My teachers who are singers are brothers, and when they sing together, they often overlap their phrases. So one of them will sing a phrase, and then the next one will start his phrase before the other one is finished. And so there's a brief moment where they're both singing together. And it often creates these extremely beautiful harmonies. And sometimes they only do it once in a while in a performance, and sometimes they do it about 90% of the time. It's very interesting. And when they first started doing this, some of the more conservative members of the Indian community didn't like it. And they're like, what are you guys doing? But they just forged ahead. And it's quite beautiful what they've created. But every time they do it, to me, it brings back a lot of the high Renaissance polyphony from Europe and some of the medieval polyphony. So I started a project a few years ago where, and I've now performed this several times, and I'm getting ready to finally make my first recording, where I'm basically singing traditional raga, but I'm doing it, I use a computer program where I'll sing in an alap, and then I'll sing in another alap, and I'm using a lot of counterpoint and polyphony ideas that I learned from studying the high Renaissance vocal polyphony of the great masters of Europe. So I'll play you a little example of that so you can hear it. And I did play this for my gurus, and they loved it. And what made me very happy is that they told me that not only did they think it was working, but that it was actually preserving the ethics of the raga. So they believed it. This is Rag Malkans. They said it's still Rag Malkans, but you've brought a new flavor in it with the polyphony. Okay, so it gives you a little idea of the project I'm working on.
So all these voices were yours?
Yeah. So what I
recognize Marco. It's my favorite hour. Beautiful.
Well, thank you. That's very sweet of you. So what I'm doing is it's a little convoluted, but I'll see if I can clear it. So I sing one alap and I start from the middle sa. I'm lucky I have a 2.5 octave range, so I have some range to play with. So I start on the middle sa, which is like do in Western music, and I gradually work up to the high sa. Then I recorded another alap where I start on the same sa, but I gradually work down to the low, and then I put them together. So as one is gradually going up, the other one is gradually going down. So you have what we call in Western music this long range contrary motion. Then at the same time that I do that, the one that goes up, I recorded a third alap that also goes up, but it kind of follows the other one. The term we use is heterophony. So if you think of like a Khyal performance, when you have a singer and you have a sarangi player following along, it's like that. And then I did the same thing over here. I sang a fourth alap going down, but I sang it kind of in heterophony with the other one. And then I panned them. So the primary one going up is far right, the primary one going down is far left. And then the other one going down, I put far right, and the other one going up, I put far left, but I put them further in the background. So what I was trying to do, because what's interesting about high Renaissance vocal polyphony from Europe is that when you're in a cathedral or a good set of headphones with a great ensemble, like the Tallis Scholars, for example, is that the music, to me, has a very spherical experience, right? The music, it moves around you in this way, like in your mind and your body and your heart and your ears, and physically when you're in the cathedral, because oftentimes they would have different choirs placed around the congregation. And those big, if you've been in those big cathedrals, you know they're incredibly resonant. So the voices were all kind of swirling in this spherical way. And the way that music works modally is that usually you get this kind of buildup of voices, and then it just sort of planes out for a while and then collapses to some kind of harmonic cadence, and then builds up again and does that again. Different than Indian classical music, where you get these long ramps, where it gradually builds up, builds up, builds up. So what I was trying to do was kind of this sort of teleological thrust, right, with Hindustani. I was trying to marry this long ramp form with this spherical experience. That's sort of the goal with all this. So anyway, it's moving along. And I think that more or less is probably enough for the night. We don't need to talk about Philip Glass.
We want to thank you for coming.
Sure.
This program was recorded on September 20th, 2019 at the Ann Arbor District Library,